Hi, I'm Maggie MacAlpine, the Director of Cybersecurity Partnerships and Evangelism here at Seceon. And with me today,
My name is Anthony Cihan. I'm the Senior Principal Cybersecurity Engineer at Obvium.
and we're really excited to have you here with us today, Anthony. Just an absolute expert in the field. I was wondering if you could start by telling us a little about your really impressive background.
Absolutely. So I've been in security for over 11 years, going on 12 years. I started out on the defensive side. I did firewalls, sonic walls, FortiNets. I did XDR with the Seceon platform. And then I also did things like AV, EDR, Sentinel-1, Silence. I did some remote access solutions, things like that. And then from there, I eventually moved into the offensive side. Ended up leading the red team now at two different organizations, where I currently lead the red team at Obvium. So I do pen testing, red team operations, social engineering engagements, assessments, kind of the whole gambit of offensive security.
Yeah, and I think we kind of discussed this before this call, but one of the things I found so interesting about your experience is that you've really seen both sides of the fence. And we actually, with that in mind, wanted to split this into a two-parter episode. Let's first starting with the offensive capabilities and skills you've developed over the years and what you've seen in the field, and then we'll move over to the blue team and the defensive side. But can you tell us a bit about how you got into the field and, what got you to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So directly out of the Army, I had gotten injured and I was looking for a new job. And computers had kind of been my hobby. I had done some programming all the way back in high school on like robotics controllers, things like that, but nothing crazy. Security was something that interested me, but it wasn't anything that I was really heavy into. So I just threw out a ton of applications, and I eventually got picked up by a small, at the time, MSSP called Certain, and they had me come in for an interview and talk to them, and they said I made a good impression with no IT experience, and they hired me on as an analyst. So I just kind of started out as a low-level analyst, just doing like firewall outages and basic changes, and just kind of worked my way up from there. Got different vendor certifications, things like that. Then I'd say about 4 or 5 years ago, I got a lot heavier into offensive. It was something that really interested me. Started out just basic certifications, ended up getting CEH, eventually then OSCP and OSWP. So much more heavy offensive certifications. And from there, now in my current position at Obvium, I do everything from advanced malware development to, driver vulnerability research and a whole host of things that we utilize in our assessments. So it's been a full kind of range of experience from low level kind of tier one MSSP work, worked my way all the way up to principal engineer at what eventually became company Logically before coming over to Obvium here. So I've kind of had the gambit.
I can see that. And, it's always interesting to hear people's journey into cybersecurity, because I think over the last 20 years, it's been so unique kind of for everyone. Some come up through engineering, some come up through just a myriad of paths. But the one thing that really stuck out to me, what you were saying there, was your malware experience. That is not something you hear about quite as often, I think. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So previously, one of the things that I would have to do when I did more defensive work was, we would see malware samples and whatnot in AV platforms, things like that. And I would have to go and kind of dig through those to see if it was a real sample, if it was a false positive, what was going on. But once I've gotten more heavy into the offensive world, when you kind of start with kind of more basic penetration testing, you're using a lot of kind of pre-baked tools. And that's really common, especially when you're going through certifications. They're teaching you how to use what's there. But once you kind of start migrating into more advanced either pen testing or you start getting into red team, what you find is that a lot of those tools or those implants, or pick your favorite term, right? But essentially malware starts getting detected. So you start writing custom stuff, which realistically is what a lot of these threat actors are doing, right? You take somebody like, Scattered Spider is the big one that's been talked about a lot recently. They're not taking an off-the-shelf tool and launching it at somebody's network. Those have been fingerprinted. We know how they behave. We know how they act. It's pretty standardized. And if you don't think that a lot of these security companies are purchasing those off-the-shelf tools and then, researching them, they do. So what you see is a lot of these threat actors develop their own tools. They develop their own injectors, their own malware samples. And what I found was that as I started working on some of my own custom items, I stopped getting detected a lot, because I was able to use kind of more niche injection methods or kind of off the wall kind of methodologies, we'll say, to start bypassing security mechanisms. So one of the things I did was I found that there was an example, a fun example is I found that there was a big AV vendor. I won't say their name, but they're a big AV vendor.
Protect the innocent and the guilty.
Yeah. So they kind of next gen AI, really common, really big. Black Hat, DEF CON, they're at all the different things.
Mhm.
And I found that there was somebody who discovered that there was a security mechanism within their agent that if resource utilization got too high on a computer, it would shut their AI agent off to try to keep the system from getting crashed. And then when the resources came back down, agent would start again. So it was a safety mechanism. It was so that the agent didn't inadvertently crash the computer. You can
Yeah, I can
imagine
see.
what I did with that. Just let that simmer for a second.
Yeah,
So what I
I
did
think I can
was,
see the problem right away there. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So what I found was is that this guy who had kind of discovered this, he didn't really provide any code. He showed kind of snippets and kind of like what he figured out. So I kind of took his idea, I reverse engineered it, figured out how to make it work, and then I wrote a PowerShell script. So it wasn't even an executable. It was a PowerShell script, so you could run it directly from memory on a computer, never touch disk, and it would essentially slowly eat up all of the allocated memory on a system and hold it with just like 256K just sitting there. That was enough to where the agent would shut itself off. And if you let it sit long enough, the agent would actually semi-permanently disable itself, which was a big problem that the other guy hadn't discovered. um, and once I did that, I could then do something like shellcode injection into memory. And now I have basically malware on the system that wasn't detected because I shut the agent off. So something like that, some of these novel things are things that just, they don't get detected because who would think like, oh, well, if you make the resource utilization too high, the agent tries to go into a safety kind of state to keep from crashing the computer. But if I do it on purpose, I can basically just shut the agent off whenever I want.
It's
So
not a bug, it's a feature.
exactly. And that's actually something that's pretty common is like feature abuse. You're not necessarily abusing a vulnerability or a flaw, but like a feature is super common. So that happens a lot.
Absolutely, yeah. We would see that all the time in my various days at DEF CON. If you could get the features to work with you, it was half the battle right there. I was gonna say, just based on that, I wanted to kind of get, what do you think is something, so not everybody has your experience. I imagine a lot of people, they work with the software kind of out of the box, or they've had a very, maybe they have more paint by numbers experience, or they got all this through school. What do you think your experience developing malware on this pen test side, doing this really creative problem solving with how to get into systems, do you think you have like a bit of advice or insight that somebody that might surprise people that comes up through your experience?
Yeah, so this was told to me by one of the guys who helped me a lot. Shout out to Sean. When I was really getting from defensive to offensive, and that was learn to code, which sounds super weird, but one of the big things that you're going to run into when you're doing offensive work is that either A, you're going to run into a situation where the tool doesn't exist. So, and I really saw this kind of firsthand with Sean. He had showed we'd run into a situation where we're working on a SCADA network, and the SCADA network, so it's like industrial manufacturing control systems, and there was no way there was a specific service. I can't remember it off the top of my head. This was a few years back, but there was no tool out there to like scan that service to see if we could connect to it. It didn't exist because these environments are kind of so really specific that tools to specifically attack SCADA networks or to kind of check SCADA networks aren't super common. At least at the time they weren't. And he actually wrote one. And I was like, oh man, that was I could see why the coding thing is getting big now. And that kind of got me more into coding. And then I ran into a couple of those situations myself, and we've run into them since then. So a good example is we ran into a situation where we were doing a pen test, and they had an Apache, I think, CouchDB. So it's a couch database. And there was a known vulnerability in that version. Well, if you went into Metasploit, there was an exploit for it. Boom. Okay, cool. We're off to the races. This is going to be easy. Except the exploit was for Linux. And it was running on Windows. So we're looking at it, we're like, oh man, like, what are we going to do? So we actually started looking at the exploit and realized, wait a minute, the exploit applies to Windows and Linux. There's just only code that exists for Linux. So we actually took the Linux code and ported it to Windows, and it worked.
Hmm.
So those kind of situations, you can run into them a lot, especially it's really heavy when you get into web pen testing. Web pen testing really gets heavy into that because now you might have to inject code into a website and it'll do what you tell it to do. But if you don't know how to code, then how do you inject the code? So coding is a lot heavier, especially as you get into more and more advanced kind of offensive security work, especially really heavy into red team operations where you're trying to be very sneaky and you're trying to be very quiet. So using something off the shelf is almost always going to get caught.
Mhm.
And trying to be as quiet as possible, you want to use more custom tools. You want to be very quiet. You want to use stuff that's custom, that's not been fingerprinted, not been seen. So the ability to code is actually really heavy in much more advanced red team and penetration testing work.
You mentioned something there that kind of caught my attention, which is just, you know, these sort of surprising stories that will come out of engagements. And I was wondering, have you ever seen something in the field, again, protecting the innocent and the guilty alike, but is there any like war story from the field that's particularly, interesting or unexpected, you think, even for others maybe in the field? I imagine everyone's got one.
Yeah, there's a couple that are just really fun. One of the ones
Mhm.
that I talk about a lot, because it actually led to an entire program at Obvium. It led to a whole program that I kind of spearheaded because of this. So I was doing a pen test for a power plant, and we came in, and they had previously had a pen test done by a very large, well-known company, and got it done. They thought they had a lot of stuff fixed. They're like, okay, hey, come in and do our next pen test. I was like, okay, awesome. We come in, and we compromised the domain and had domain admin privileges in like 37 minutes. And you're like, what? Here's here's the crazy part. Their network was actually pretty secure. And here's what happened. And this is the craziest thing because I didn't learn about kind of everything until I started talking to the customer and we kind of figured out what had happened and why this was the case. When we got in, I set up kind of a basic man in the middle attack on the network. And you're going to find that there's a kind of a, a consistency on initial access is the network. But I get some credentials, I crack them offline, and now I have access to the domain. And I use the tool Bloodhound, and I kind of pull in all the data from the domain, and I start looking at it, and it's like, hey, you can DC sync right now. And I'm like, that makes no sense. I should not have that capability right now. Why do I have the capability? So I started digging. There was an ACL, which people don't know if you're not heavy into Active Directory. Active Directory isn't just users and groups and computers. There's an entire underlying like access control list structure in Active Directory that can say like this person has admin to this person can change passwords of these users and things like that. One of the permissions is called generic all, means that you have full, essentially admin permissions to do whatever you want over a thing. Somebody, and we found out later that it was a previous vendor, had given generic all privileges over the entire domain to the everyone group. Now, here's
Hmm.
what's crazy about that. If you went into Active Directory and you looked at domain admins or administrators or enterprise admins or any of the admin groups, it was just the normal admins. Because the permission wasn't set by adding somebody to a group, it was set in an ACL.
Hmm.
And unless you go into the ACLs and specifically look at the ACLs, you won't see that. So I had this permission. I just went, oh, okay. Pulled up the Impacket library, ran secrets dump, had the entire domain. 37 minutes. And most of that was cracking the password and looking at Bloodhound and being like, I must have missed something because this can't be accurate. So come to find out what had happened was about 6, 7 months prior, they had an AD migration. And they had a vendor come in and migrate them from, I don't know what version of Windows Server to the current version. And during that migration, for some reason, they had given that permission to the everyone group. And because it was done as an ACL, nobody knew. Well, they were running Nessus scans internal. They had a patching cadence. Like everything was like, they had a good security stance. And they didn't make this change, a vendor did. So it was one of those situations where you walk into an environment and it looks secure. And there's a blatant hole that nobody knew was there. And it wasn't a vulnerability. It wasn't like, oh, they're running server 2003 that's got eternal blue or something. It was literally just a misconfiguration in AD that a vendor had done, not even the customer. And it let us literally walk in and take full control of their IT environment in less than 45 minutes.
Oof, that is ugly. And it really shows that the devil is in the details. And, an overall scan, these sort of generic scans might, there's really no experience, substitute for experience in some cases. And it also just reminds me, that convenience really is often on the sliding scale from security, huh? Because
Yeah.
I'm sure that everyone move made things a lot easier for the job that they were trying to do, but they didn't remember to turn it off after.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's pretty common. Little misconfigurations like that is honestly what leads to the vast majority of the compromises that I do.
yeah, which actually that was going to be kind of what I was thinking of for our next question was just like, what what should the field be doing more of? What should red teamers be doing more of, or like just like cautionaries even that come from your experience? The advice you'd give to everyone.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
both
maybe that's too
defensive
broad.
and offensive.
Mhm.
The biggest thing that I've run into isn't necessarily vulnerabilities. It's not. It's misconfigurations and weak configurations. That will get you more times than a vulnerability will. Because let's say you have a threat actor and they use some 0-day piece of malware never been seen before, custom written, right? And they get it on a system, they social engineer one of your users. Well, you're never going to see that, right? Like there's nothing you can really do to stop something like that. If they specifically write it to get past things, there's not much you can do. So if they get in, what are they going to do? Most of the time, it's not going to be an exploit. It's not going to be some remote code execution. They popped a shell on a system. It's going to be they have user permissions. What can that user do? What can that user see? And they're going to abuse it as far as you can imagine. And it's not that hard, right? And that's the biggest thing. If you walk into an environment and I drop Nessus down and I scan the environment, you're going to see a bazillion vulnerabilities. 99% of them are not going to be exploitable. They're just not. This thing is out of date, that thing's out of date. Microsoft found a vulnerability in like Exchange or something, and it's not really exploitable. There's no POC for it. You can't really do anything. That's going to be probably 99% of them. 1% of them, maybe you can do something with. But what's much more likely is they're going to come in and they're going to say, oh, that user has access to a file share. What's on the file share? Oh, there's some VMs on the file share that they backed up to the file share. Let me download those. Let me open up those VMs. Well, you know what you can do if you open up a VM? I can pull the password files out of that VM. Which means if that admin password on that VM is the same admin password on another system, or maybe the active machine, well, now I have the admin password. So now I have admin to something, right? And that's a new next step. Or I'm going to walk in and I'm going to say, okay, well, what's out on the network? And I find that you have Active Directory certificate services. The number of times that I've exploited Active Directory certificate services is insane because most people will install ADCS, get it set up, and then kind of walk away from it because it was some requirement for some software package that they had. And whatever that software package did to set up templates for certificates or whatever their domain controller did to get certs so that they could do SSL on some service, they're just kind of like, okay, cool, it's set up, and they just walk away and they assume that the default configuration is secure. But most of the time it's not. And that happens a lot. Like a massive number of times where either the default configuration is vulnerable or somebody has something out on a file share. Or there's one where I found that I could log into O365 from their office. I had compromised the system. I got creds. I could log into O365, and that was basically all I could do. They had really good firewall rules in place. I could only hit like 2 servers on the server network that were file servers. It was really restricted, but I could log into O365. And when I did, I found that their IT SharePoint was open to everybody.
Hmm.
And they may or may not have had a file called local admin passwords.doc.
Unfortunate. At that point, you're better off just having a notebook sitting on your desk.
Basically.
Yeah.
But that happens a lot. It's super common. That just little things, little configuration issues, little, I didn't change the default config. I left this thing turned on. Happens a lot. It's super, super common. And that's honestly where most of the breaches that I do come from. It's little misconfigurations in your environment that you can chain together to do something that you're not supposed to.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so, challenging, I think, just from the defender perspective, because we're going to be pivoting to that next in our next episode with you. But just, how the defender has to be right kind of all of the time, and the attacker just has to be right. And it's these devil in the details, often these little misconfigurations, these little mistakes, things you may never catch that will sometimes give away the farm.
Yeah, it's true. And what I've always said to people is that there's almost no situation where an attacker can't do something, right? Whether it's gain some level of access, some level of data, permission, something. And the goal isn't always necessarily to make sure that you can't get hacked. It's almost never going to be possible. There's going to be some 0-day, some piece of malware, something, right? It's almost never the case that you're never going to get hacked. The question is can you make the attacker's life as miserable as possible to where they make a mistake? Because that's how you catch them. So if I come into an environment, everything's secure, and you have proper monitoring, you have proper endpoint detection, and you have good firewall config, and you have good alerting for cloud services, and all of these things are in place, can I eventually get something? Yes. But I'm going to have to make noise to do it. And that's where you catch me. That's where you stop me, is when you make it so difficult for me to do something that I have to make noise to do it. Then you know I'm there. Now you can start the remediation procedure of locking me out. But if there's a whole host of things I can do, oh, that's a whole different ballgame. I mean, it's super common that things like Active Directory attacks against certificate services, so ADCS, do not get detected by anybody. It's super common because while you might be checking for authentication, almost nobody monitors certificate services. And the way that I would attack certificate services is normally by network manipulation. And what I've run into a lot is that people will monitor their endpoints. They might monitor the cloud, and they might even have like really good firewall monitoring. Very few people monitor the network or monitor the network fully. So when I come into an environment, and I actually briefly talked about this at Black Hat, actually, with Seceon, was that it's super common that when I come into an environment, I can attack the network and it never gets seen. So, and that kind of goes into the kind of the trifecta of what I say is important for monitoring. If you actually want to catch me doing things, you need cloud, endpoint, network. If you're missing one of those, that's an entire blind spot that an attacker can abuse that you're never going to see until they've already gained some level of permission to move to the other kind of points, right? So if you're not monitoring the network and I come into the network, actually, here's a great example. So I brought this with me, actually, to Black Hat. This is a fun one. So this little guy right here, this is a wiretap. So this is one that I created. I called it the pie squirrel. I got annoyed that an off-the-shelf kind of wiretap wasn't available for months. So I just said, fine, I'll make my own.
I'll do it myself.
I made this. Yeah, basically. And so what I did was, if I come into your network and I put this behind a computer, and it's got two interfaces. One goes into the computer, one goes into the wall. So it doesn't even take an extra Ethernet port. It's USB powered. I literally just plug it into your back of your computer, stick it to the back of your computer, and walk away. And that's how small it is. You're never going to know it's there. And it actually pretends to be a printer. So if you scan your network consistently, it'll actually come back as a printer.
Oh, and who doesn't have an old printer sitting on the network, right?
So actually, I did that. I actually cloned the behavior of my actual brother printer that sits behind me. So if you scan my network, and this is online, it looks like there's two brother printers.
Yeah, and could easily be a duplicate or just a misunderstanding, or there's plenty of innocent explanations.
Oh yeah, I mean, Sally over in HR needed to print off some documents, so she just grabbed a printer from the room, or she just grabbed a printer off Amazon, plugged it in, and she's just been using it. Happens all the time. Like that, nobody would think anything else if you're scanning your network, so you see another printer, right? Nobody thinks anything other. But if I come in and I drop this on your network, I'm not touching your endpoints and I'm not touching your cloud. Only thing I'm touching is your network. But now I have full man in the middle capability. I can poison your network. I can man in the middle the user traffic. I can ARP spoof. I can, ASREP roast. I can curb roast. I can anything. This thing can do anything. This little device, 4 gigs of RAM and a quad core processor, which is what used to be like standard in laptops. Like it can do anything. And you're never going to see it on your network if you're not specifically monitoring the network and network behavior. And that's what I run into all the time. It's super, super common. And that's why I'm so heavy on in my reports and kind of like my reviews on pen tests and red team operations and kind of everything that we do, kind of that network monitoring. Because as an attacker, network manipulation is like easy mode. It really is.
And sometimes you don't even have to go beyond that from the sound of it.
Yeah.
Well, I think I want to wrap us up here because I'm just dying for us to pivot to the blue team side of things. But I think I think you've earned a soft plug for Obvium. It sounds like if people have Obvium, they're in a better place against these threats.
Yeah, so over at Obvium, we do obviously red team, pen tests, social engineering engagements, kind of the whole gambit. We also have a program called ASD, which came from that pen test that I mentioned, where they had that AD misconfiguration, where we actually utilize an automated pen testing platform to kind of fill the gap between the manual pen tests that we do. So it kind of acts as a cyber hygiene. But we also have a SOC. So we do SOC as a service, and we actually utilize the Seceon platform for our SOC as a service for customers. So if you need network monitoring, if you want to implement that kind of next step in kind of cyber monitoring and remediation, we have a SOC, and we can actually work with you to monitor and respond to your network. And we also do vCISO services, so we can help you get compliant with different kind of, whether it's NIST or CMMC or whatever it happens to be. We can help you get compliant and kind of work on your cyber maturity. So that's kind of the big items that we do. But yeah, we can help you out with basically anything that you need cyber-wise.
And obviously, we at Seceon have nothing but the highest respect for Obvium's amazing team. So thank you so much for coming on our show, Anthony. And very soon, coming up next, we're going to have the blue team side. And Anthony's going to tell us more about how to defend against all of this, which is what I'm very excited for coming up next. Thank you.
Thank you.